James Munro Bertram. James Munro Bertram, 11 August 1910 – 24 August 1993, was a New Zealand Rhodes Scholar, a journalist, writer, relief worker, prisoner of war and a university professor. Early life and influences. Bertram was born in Auckland on 11 August 1910, son of Ivo Edgar Bertram, a Presbyterian minister, and his wife, Evelyn Susan Bruce. His great-grandparents on both sides had arrived in Wellington in the 1840s. He spent 10 years of his childhood in Melbourne and Sydney and attended church schools. He returned to New Zealand for secondary schooling at Waitaki Boys High School, where he befriended Charles Brash and Ian Milner, the son of headmaster Frank Milner. Between 1929 and 1931 he studied English literature at Auckland University College, where he met the third of his closest friends, J.A. W. Bennett. He edited a literary magazine, Phoenix, and with Bennett co-edited a student Christian movement magazine, Open Windows. In 1932 Bertram received a diploma in journalism and was awarded a Rhodes Scholarship. Bertram was briefly a student volunteer special constable during the Queen Street riots of April 1932, to find that his sympathies for those from less privileged backgrounds had grown. Oxford. Studying at New College, Oxford, he was awarded a first-class honours degree in English in 1934 and a second-class honours in modern languages, French and German, the following year. He was active in rugby and left-wing clubs including the University Labour Club, and he initiated an Oxford branch of the Independent Labour Party. During university vacations he visited Italy in 1933, the Soviet Union in 1934, Germany in 1935, where in Munich he witnessed a rally led by Hitler, and visited the Soviet Union for a second time in 1936. Following Oxford, Bertram was briefly an international correspondent with the Times in London, but left after the editor Geoffrey Dawson refused to run his article predicting a sweeping victory for Labour in the New Zealand 90. He then took a short-term teaching position at St. Paul's School in Hammersmith before accepting an offer by the Rhodes Trust in late 1935 for a one-year traveling fellowship to Japan and China. He was 25 at the time. Beijing. In January 1936, Bertram arrived in the then Paping Peking/Beijing with commissions from several British publications including The Times, The Manchester Guardian, and The New Statesman to write freelance articles on Asian issues. In Beijing, Bertram studied Chinese, including at Yenching University. Bertram's other roommate was Zhang Jialin Cheng Kaolin, who was to become the editor of a Xianjin daily newspaper under the control of the young Marshal Zhang Zuoliang. In Beijing, Bertram also met American correspondent Edgar Snow, who had been teaching journalism at Yenching University, and his wife Peg Snow. Bertram later wrote that meeting the Snows was for me the real turning point in my discovery of modern China. Soon after Bertram's arrival in Peking, Snow traveled to northwest China on a trip which was to produce in 1937 what Bertram described as the classical scoop of modern Asian reporting, Red Star over China, which told the world the story of Mao Zedong, Zhu De, and their associate. Snow introduced Bertram to key figures as Ememi Sun Yat-sen Su Qingling, the widow of Sun Yat-sen, New Zealander Riwi Ali, the Chinese writer Lu Xun Lu H-sun, and the American revolutionary activist Agnes Medley. Zen Incident. On 12 December 1936, in Peking, Bertram observed an anti-Japanese student demonstration of some 5,000 students, which he described in his article the 12th of December. It was later learnt that General Chiang Kai-shek had been seized earlier that day by the northeastern Dongbei troops loyal to the young marshal in Xi'an until Chiang agreed to enter into a united front with the communist forces against. Bertram traveled to in a difficult 11-day journey, including crossing the frozen over Yellow River on foot to report on what later became known as the Zen Incident or the Xianjin Mutiny. He was the only foreign journalist to reach the city, which was under blockade by the Kuomintang. Mail and telegraph communications being blocked, Bertram joined Agnes Smedley in providing radio reports on the situation in the rebel capital during his month-long stay. The Zen Incident is seen now as a turning point in modern Chinese history as it marked the formal end of the 10-year civil war between nationalists and communists and the beginning of an effective united front of resistance to Jun. Then, on the basis of his Zen reports, Bertram's Rhodes Traveling Fellowship was renewed for a second year. Back in Beijing, together with Edgar Snow, he founded an English-language journal, Democracy, which was translated into Chinese and widely circulated. The material published in the journal formed the core of his book Crisis in China 1937, which he wrote in the home of Ida Prout. In July 1937, shortly after arriving in Tokyo on his first visit, Japan launched the second phase of its invasion of China. Bertram hurriedly returned to Beijing just days before the Japanese captured the city. Together with Edgar Snow, they evacuated to Tianjin with Zhou Enlai's wife Deng Yingqiao disguised as Snow's household servant before finding their way back to Xi'an. Yan'an and the North China Front. In Xi'an, Bertram received a radio message from Mao Zedong, inviting him to become the first official British visitor to Yan'an. Bertram spent nearly a month in Yan'an, during which time he conducted an extensive series of interviews with Mao in his cave dwelling, during which Mao expounded the Japanese objectives and the strategies he believed that the Chinese should. Interview with the British journalist James Bertram was cited in Mao's collected works. From Yan'an, Bertram set out for the 8th Route Army headquarters in southern Shanxi and traveled for 5 months with the army in northern China. On the day that he crossed the Yellow River from Shanxi back to Shanxi, this time by boat, Taiyuan, the Shanxi capital, fell to the Japanese. Most of his time was spent with the troops of General Heilong Ho-lung. Based on these experiences, behind the front, Bertram wrote a book, North China Front 1939. Relief work and enemy Sun Yat-sen. Bertram began to more actively support China's war against the Japanese and carried out aid work with the China Defense League CDL under Madame Sun Yat-sen Su Qingling. The CDL was a relief committee formed in Hong Kong to help maintain Norman Bethune and the international peace hospitals in China's northern war area. During this time, Bertram gave fundraising lectures in the U.S. and led a convoy of supply trucks with petrol and medical supplies from Haiphong in Vietnam to Yan'an. Partway through this journey, England declared war on Germany. Suddenly I remembered I was a New Zealander. I caught the first plane back and came home. The first troop contingent being already fully enlisted, he was given permission to return to China, and early in 1940 he arrived in Hong Kong to continue work on the organization of medical relief with the CDL and also with the British Ministry of Information, spending his time between Hong Kong and the Chinese wartime capital of Chongqing. Prisoner of war. From January 1941, he also spent a few months as relief press attaché to the British ambassador in Chongqing, which involved bringing a British supply convoy over the Burma Road from Rangoon. He returned to Hong Kong and played a role in assisting enemy Sun Yat-sen and her sister Soong Ai Ling/Emily Kung to evacuate to Chongqing hours before Hong Kong fell to the Japanese. Captured by the Japanese as a volunteer gunner in December 1941, he spent 2 years in Hong Kong as prisoner of war, during which time he caught diphtheria. This was followed by 2 more difficult years as a prisoner of war in the Aomori camp in Tokyo Bay, spent doing forced labor in rail yards and on the Tokyo docks. Bertram witnessed firsthand the devastating effect of the bombing of the Tokyo-Yokohama area and saw the coming of the victorious Allies by air and sea after the Japanese surrender in 1945. In later years, rather than talk of his experience as a Japanese prisoner of war, he would direct people to books by Sir Lawrence Vander Post, saying they are true, in a way few other books about the Japanese are. Bertram thought it unlikely that many of the 350,000 prisoners still held by the Japanese in 1945 would have survived had the war not been brought to a sudden end by the atomic bomb. Far Eastern Commission. In early 1946, Bertram was back in Japan as an advisor to the New Zealand delegation led by Sir Karl Bjornson to the Far Eastern Commission, which was working out the details of occupation policy under the Allied Supreme Commander, General Douglas MacArthur. Bertram described this unexpected trip as therapeutic. It gave the opportunity to work off all the hangovers of prison camp, and perhaps help in one or two small ways to see that belated justice was done. He saw some of his former captors and participated in the demolition of the Aomori camp. Repatriation to New Zealand. Bertram returned to New Zealand in 1946 and wrote The Shadow of a War, A New Zealand in the Far East, 1939–1946, a personal narrative of his experience during the Second World War and Japanese prisoner of war camps. Predicting that the communists would win out over the Kuomintang, he decided against returning to China. Life wasn't going to be easy for foreigners in China, while the two main factions fought it out. In 1947, 15 years after they had first met, Bertram married Jean Ellen Stevenson, an editor with the New Zealand Listener, and they settled in the Hutt Valley near Wellington in 1949. They shared an interest in horse riding and building a garden out of a couple of acres of hillside bush. China relief work. Bertram also traveled throughout the country as appeals organizer for the Council of Organizations for Relief Services Overseas Corso, directing aid to Mme Soong Ching Ling's orphanages and to Riwi Ali's Chinese industrial cooperatives, also known by the abbreviation Indusco or the Chinese name Gung Ho. He considered that Ali's reputation at the time was comparable with that of a Dr. Schweitzer or a Mother Teresa. The Bailey Training School at Shandon Sandon in the far northwest remained as a nursery of Chinese industrial apprentices and cooperative organizers, with Ali as its headmaster and inspiration. In 1940, Bertram had acted as intermediary for. Due to chaotic wartime conditions, the sheep were offloaded in Calcutta, and in 1944 were rediscovered in Tibet. In 1946, the chance came again for Bertram. An UNRWA ship was taking a stud flock to China, and Bertram organized a public appeal, as a result of which an additional 50 sheep were purchased and earmarked for the Bailey School. In 1986, nearly 40 years later, Bertram finally visited Shandon and saw the descendants of the original flock. Support for New Zealand literature. Bertram was a strong supporter of New Zealand literature. He helped Charles Brash to found the Landfall Journal and wrote many literary reviews, especially for the New Zealand Listener. He specialized in the lives and work of 19th-century British poets A.H. Clough, Matthew Arnold, and his younger brother Thomas Arnold the Younger, who arrived in New Zealand in 1848. Bertram sorted and edited a collection of letters by Thomas Arnold from 1847 to 1851. I felt I might begin with a critical study of Clough's poetry, then switch to the impulsive Tom Arnold, whose abrupt changes of political and religious faith covered, in one lifetime, the whole gamut of Victorian disbelief and belief. I could not help feeling that this inner circle of Dr. Arnold's favorite pupils had some resemblance to our own little Waitaki group. After his retirement in 1975, he was general editor of the New Zealand Writers and their work series, wrote on Charles Brash and Dan Davin, and edited Brash's memoir In Directions. In 1981, he received an honorary Lit.D. In 1985, Bertram published some of his reflections on New Zealand writers in Flight of the Phoenix. Asian Studies advocacy. Academic interests were evenly divided between Bertram's Clough Arnold project and his own strong wish to promote Asian studies at Victoria. In earlier years, after returning to New Zealand, he had run evening classes on China, Japan, and Far Eastern affairs. In 1960, he accepted a Carnegie Travel grant to prepare an extended report on both English literature and Oriental studies as taught in North American universities. He was, however, unsuccessful when the university did make an appointment in Asian studies. The university chose an expert in the politics of Indonesia who had no interest in any major Asian language. Return visits to China. In 1956, Bertram visited China again with a New Zealand cultural group. The Chinese government's invitation came to Ormond Wilson, a former Labour MP, and to R.A.K. Mason, a poet and chairman of the China Friendship Society, to assemble a representative group of New Zealanders for an all-expenses-paid visit to visit China and attend the May Day celebrations in Beijing. Cold War hostilities meant that no official New Zealand support was forthcoming for the visit, although New Zealand had not gone as far as the US and Australia in withdrawing passports from those who planned to visit China. Initially, Victoria University had refused leave for Bertram, but later relented. Bertram wrote that in 1956 China was doing its best to present a relaxed and liberal image to the world. No one at this time could have foreseen the savage rift with Khrushchev's Russia that was to follow, still less the internal tensions and sudden violent excesses of the so-called Cultural Revolution. pp. 300-301, Capes of China. During the Beijing visit he was reintroduced to his old friends, including his former roommate at Yenching University, now Deputy Foreign Minister, Huang Hue, and Rui Ali. Premier Zhou Enlai hosted a welcoming function, at which they were introduced to senior leaders of the regime including Mao Zedong, Heilong Zhu de Peng Dehuai, and Liu Shaoqi. In Shanghai, Bertram met up with Mimi Soong Ching-ling, who had founded the China Welfare Institute, heir to the old China Defense League. Bertram wrote up the expedition in a book, Return to China. In 1986, he traveled to China as an honorary guest of the Chinese government for the 50th anniversary of Chiang Kai-shek's capture during the Zen Incident, and also visited the Shandon Bailey School for the first time. Political views. For some years, Bertram remained active in left-wing groups, such as the Society for Closer Relations with Russia, and was the first president of the Wellington branch of the New Zealand China Friendship Society. After his 1956 China visit as part of a New Zealand cultural delegation, he wrote, "All of us, I have no doubt, were trying to tell the truth as we saw it." While Bertram was an admirer of Rui Ali, who he described as a remarkable New Zealander, he also wrote, "I didn't like the tone of Rui's books about the new China. Everything was black and white. All the key issues seemed oversimplified." Christian belief. Bertram described himself as at least a nominal Christian, up to the end of his university years. When in China he had stopped attending church, although there were a few practical Christians he greatly admired. In 1947, Bertram was married at the Auckland Registry Office, as he had left off church-going too long to feel a church service appropriate. However, he remained an occasional church-goer, remaining as an adherent of the Scottish Presbyterian Church, and in later years he and his wife returned to full communion with the Presbyterian Church. He wrote, "I think we were the better for it, though I remain convinced that the only consolations of religion that really matter are those that are hardest to take." James Bertram died in Lower Hutt on 24 August 1993, survived by his wife Jean. They had no children. Works. Bertram had a number of works published. This section needs further research. Asia. Crisis in China, Macmillan and Co., 1937. Also published under the title of First Act in China, The Story of the Jin Mutiny. New York, The Viking Press, 1938. North China Front, Macmillan and Co., London, 1939. Published as Unconquered. Journal of a Year's Adventures Among the Fighting Peasants of North China in New York by the John Day Company, 1939. Includes interviews with Chairman Mao and Chu Enlai. Beneath the Shadow, A New Zealander in the Far East, 1939-46. New York, J. Day Company, 1947. Published as The Shadow of a War in London and New Zealand. Return to China. London, William Heinemann Limited, 1957. The Young Traveler in China Today. London, Phoenix House, 1961. Capes of China Slide Away. A Memoir of Peace and War, 1910-1980. Auckland University Press, New York. Distributed outside New Zealand by Oxford University Press, 1993. Bertram's works have been published in China, in both English and Chinese. Bertram's Chinese name is Bai Ti Lan Pinyin Bai Telan. First act in China, The Story of the Jin Mutiny, James Bertram. Foreign Languages Press, 2003. Zhang Guo Dai Yi Mu Zai and Shi Bayan Zin Zai Lan Bai Ti Lan Y Wen Chu Ban Shi 2003. North China Front. English edition James Bertram. Foreign Languages Publishing Press, 2004. Hue Bei Kai and Zion Ying Wen Ban Bai Ti Lan James Bertram Suoji Y Wen Chu Ban Shi 2004. Return to China. English edition James Bertram. Foreign Languages Publishing Press, 2004. Zhang Fan Zhang Guo Ying Wen Ban Bai Ti Lan James Bertram Zuoji Y Wen Chu Ban Shi 2004. First act in China, The Story of the Jin Mutiny, James Bertram. Shaanxi People's Publishing Press, December 2007. Translator Niu Yulan Zhang Guo de Dai Yi Mu Zai and Shi Bayan Mai Wen Bai Ti Lan Zuo Ji, Niu Yulin Yi Ji Chu Ban, Shenzai Renmin Chu Ban Shi 2007.12. New Zealand and Other Works. New Zealand Rhodes Scholars, year and publisher not known. The Adventures of Chanticleer and Partlet. Translated from the German. Authors Jacob Grimm, Wilhelm Grimm, James M. Bertram, Christchurch, Caxton Press, 1941. New Zealand Letters of Thomas Arnold the Younger with further letters from Van Diemen's Land and letters of Arthur Hugh Clough, 1847-1851. Authors Thomas Arnold, Arthur Hugh Clough, James M. Bertram. University of Auckland, London, Wellington, Oxford University Press, 1966. Occasional Verses, Wellington, YT Otta Press, 1971. Towards a New Zealand Literature, Dunedin, Hucken Library, 1971. Charles Brash, Last Landfall. Wellington, New York, Oxford University Press, 1976. New Zealand Love Poems. Dunedin, J. McIndoe, 1977. Dan Davin, Auckland, New York, Oxford University Press, 1983. Flight of the Phoenix, Critical Notes on New Zealand Authors. Victoria, Victoria University Press, 1985. New Zealand Poets in Retrospect. 8 New Zealand poets, no longer living, are placed in social and poetic context. Catherine Mansfield, Robin Hyde, Charles Brash, R.A.K. Mason, A.R.D. Fairburn, James K. Baxter, Dennis Glover, M.K. Joseph. James M. Bertram, Replay Radio NZ Wellington, Radio New Zealand, Replay Radio 1986. Autobiography. New Zealand's China Experience. 2 of Bertram's articles were included in New Zealand's China Experience, published with the assistance of the New Zealand Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade to mark the 40th anniversary of the establishment of diplomatic relations between New Zealand and the People's Republic of China. The first piece was the 12th of December, in which Bertram wrote about an anti-Japanese student demonstration in Beijing in 1936 on the day that the Zen Incident took place. The second article was the way to Yenin, describing Bertram's invitation by Mao Zedong to become the first official British visitor. Works on James Bertram. James McNeish wrote about Bertram in his book Dance of the Peacocks, New Zealanders in Exile in the Time of Hitler and Mao Zedong. Based on the story of 5 diverse yet closely connected New Zealanders, Dance of the Peacocks is the story of a group of Rhodes scholars who went to Oxford but couldn't come home again. James Munro Bertram, Dan Davin, Geoffrey Cox, Ian Milner, and John Mulgan. James Bertram Scholarship. in commemoration of the role Bertram played in furthering New Zealand's relations with China. Rodney Jones and Sajini Jesudasan established the James Bertram Scholarships. Scholarship students study at Victoria for a year and then have 6 months language tuition in Beijing before embarking on a year's study at Peking University. Students graduate with a double master's in international relations and public policy from Victoria and Peking universities, respectively. The scholarships were launched at Victoria University in July 2010 and were announced in Beijing by the New Zealand Prime Minister, the RT Han John Key.